Sverdrup. I'm the director of NUPI. Welcome to this seminar. This seminar is on migration, of course, but it's also part of a Europe seminar series sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Part of our Europe research activity is sponsored by the Norwegian Research Council, so I have to say that in first. Let me also warn you that this meeting will be streamed, so it's accessible for, and when you take the floor later on, so you're aware that your remarks will be recorded for forever, so to say. Great to see that so many have come here. That's not surprising because this is a very hot, very important topic. And I think not a day passes without all of us seeing images, stories that deeply affect us, that is heartbreaking. It's a deep humanitarian crisis. Lots of people are suffering. And at the same time, we see that a lot of people also mobilize solidarity. They show their willingness to help and to do their utmost to reduce suffrage. Norway and Norwegians also do their share in this. But we are faced with a deep and structural crisis as well. I think there are three big issues that we have to address. The first is why are migrants coming to Europe? Of course, this is related to war. Many people are refugees. We also see that people are leaving their own country because they don't see any economic prospects. They want to improve their future. The second set of issues relate to how Europe is dealing with this tragic humanitarian situation. It's a fundamental challenge that people risk their lives in order to enter the borders of Europe. It's also a big issue about distribution of responsibility within Europe. And then the third set of issues is what would be the long-term political and institutional solution to this? What should Europe do, not only on the immediate humanitarian issues, but what would be the long-term political solution to the issue? I think all of these three issues are challenging. They raise a lot of moral questions, but they're also about sharing our responsibility. It's about the European identity, European values, and what kind of society we would like to be. We should also note that the migration issue is a very politically contested issue in all societies, also in this society, in Norway. So it's particularly challenging to formulate policies. The seminar is called The Mediterranean Migration Crisis and the Role of the EU. But as all of us know, that migration routes are changing. They are dynamic. And these days, or the last few weeks, we also see that the migration route through the Balkans is increasing. We have been very fortunate, I think, to have Dr. Ferruccio Pastore to join us. He is the director of the International and European Forum for Immigration Research. He has a PhD from the European University Institute. He has been working on migration issues for 20 years in various positions. And he's also an Italian, and Italy is a key country in dealing with migration issues. His remarks, he will talk for 30 minutes or so. We will be generous. If you want to talk a bit more, he can talk for a bit more. And then his remarks will be followed by Pernille Rieker, one of our researchers who's been working on EU's relationship with its neighborhood. And Morten Bøås, another of our researchers at NUPI, has been working a lot on the, let's say, instabilities in Africa, northwestern Africa, and also talk. He will also talk a bit about refugee situation and the refugee regime internationally. So on this short presentation, I give the floor to Ferruccio. Please.
Thank you, Ulf. Good morning, everybody. Thank you to NUPI for the kind invitation. Mediterranean migration crisis. I should start by saying that until a few months ago, until last year, I would have resisted the use of the term migration crisis from a European point of view. If only out of respect for proportions and for the disparity of the flows to the region, to the neighboring countries around Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, 4 million persons, and the much smaller contingent of refugees who made it to Europe. Of course, this has been changing rapidly over the last year, and we can start talking about a crisis, a major crisis, not so much for the sheer numbers, but for the dramatic amount of suffering, of course, associated with the flows, and for the equally dramatic political impact on the European Union and the European integration as a whole. So it's a crisis. I will focus my presentation on the political dimension of the crisis from a European Union's perspective. So I'm looking at one of the many facets of this very complex situation. I think that my colleagues, Pernille and Morten, will address other aspects more connected with international relations dimension, with the migration dynamics at a regional and macro-regional level. I'm focusing on the political impact of the crisis and the responses to it. I think that in order to do this, we have to take a historical perspective. We have to adopt an historical perspective and to approach the issue from afar, because I do think that this crisis, this political crisis, has very deep roots, very deep and I would say neglected roots, political roots, neglected because for long, European integration as a whole, I would say, but particularly so in the area of justice and home affairs, where traditionally migration has been placed, it has long been perceived as a technocratic field of governance, where it was about conventions, agreements, partnerships, not about power, not about real interests. For long, and yesterday some of your colleagues from NUPI was confirming that until recently, Schengen was classified as a technical issue within the institutional, Norwegian institutional setting. And this was the case throughout Europe. And this contributed to hide the politics of it, which have always been there, but have become dramatically evident in the last few years. And when politics is removed, is pushed away, it often bounces back. It often backfires. You don't take care of the political dimension of an issue, and suddenly you find it exploding in your hands, and this is what is happening. This is also an explanation for what I think can be defined, the appalling lack of strategic thinking on the geopolitics of migration to Europe, which is something that we all are, in different positions, trying to fill, to make to address, starting with large countries. It's yesterday's news that Hollande and Merkel made official their attempt to support the Commission in enforcing a scheme for mandatory relocation across the 25 members of the European Union. Excluded are the 3 opt-outs, Denmark, Ireland, and UK, as you know. But let's go back in history for a second. The decisive turning point is, in my view, it's quite clearly 1990. At the distance of a few days, Schengen Convention and Dublin Convention are signed. Clearly, it's part of the same political project. And it marks the end of a very important phase in the geography of migration to, from, and within Europe, which started at the beginning of the 70s. The period between the beginning of the 70s till the end of the 80s marks a real revolution, a Copernican revolution in the dynamics of migration in Europe. Old immigration, so-called old immigration countries, continental European countries, primarily France and Germany, Belgium and others, stop recruiting for labor purposes on a mass scale in the early 70s. Southern European countries turn into receiving countries out of economic changes, progress, demographic problems, and partly out of a redirection of flows which used to be directed towards continental European countries, more northern European countries. There is a gradual establishment of controls across the Mediterranean, whereas the Mediterranean until the 80s was a relatively free space of movement for people. No visa. It was a visa-less area. It started in the 80s with France introducing visas for North African countries. And finally, in this period, we have incipient east-west flows, but of course, still with the Iron Curtain representing a major migration blocking device at pan-European level. So if we start that period with this kind of configuration, a wall to the east, a migratory wall, I'm not speaking of the Iron Curtain in political terms now, and an area of circulation from Southern European countries to Northern European countries for economic purposes until some point, until the 70s, and also from Northern Africa to Europe, at the end of this period, we have the opposite situation. So Europe opens to the east and closes to the south, to put it very schematically. Which are the policy responses? I'm running through it very, I'm cutting it very simple, but I think it's essential to understand what has been happening in the last few years. The policy responses to these macro changes in the 80s, 70s, 80s, were first progressing relatively fast towards an internal liberalization of flows in the European Union, but in an enlarging European Union. An external defensive harmonization, I'm calling it. So European Union member states gradually converge in their standards to protect their borders essentially from southern immigration, North Africa, Middle East, and farther on, and farther afield. Convergence of asylum systems, very important. Triggered principally by Germany, when Germany in 1992 finds itself with 450,000 asylum claims, more than currently. It's expected to get to 800,000 by the end of the year, but we are not there yet. Out of 650,000 claims throughout Europe in 92. Higher numbers than today, but it was a different thing because it was from one area of conflict, relatively well demarcated, former Yugoslavia, but it had a defining power in structuring the European migration and asylum regime. So this is how Europe evolves, a widening Europe with a common external border and an evolving but positively evolving, progressing area of freedom of movement in different forms inside the common external borders. What is crucial is that this emerging migration regime was based from the outset, from 1990. You have to go back and read the Dublin Convention and the Schengen Convention because all is already there on two fundamental principles. One is the Schengen, what I call the Schengen principle, consisting in the fact that each member state is responsible for the control of its own stretch of external borders in the common interest on behalf of all other member states, but basically at its own costs. There are minor transfers, border fund, but essentially it's the business of the bordering countries of the European Union to perform their duty to control the external border. Second principle, which is closely associated with the first, is Dublin Principle. So the member state it's very, famous now. It was known only to a few, experts until a few months ago or years ago. The country of first entry is responsible for dealing with asylum applications by irregular entrants. It's not the first criterion in the convention. There is a number of other criteria. But when it comes to irregular mixed flows from the outside to inside, which is the way in which currently asylum seekers can get to Europe from poor countries of origin, the criterion is this one, the country of first entry. So the peripheral countries, again, are invested with a central responsibility. So it's completely asymmetrical. It's basically placing the burden on peripheral countries. Core countries, peripheral countries, border countries. An interesting question, I'm not sure I can go into the details here, but is how could such a regime be agreed upon in the beginning? Because normally a consensual international regime is based on agreement, on consensus. It might be a nudged consensus, but here there was no debate in late 1980s on this particular asymmetry. It was kind of hidden. I think it's a crucial historiographic question. Why Germany, which was certainly in the driving seat of European integration in justice and home affairs at the time, pushed for such a regime when it was still a border country, because enlargement was still to happen, and also German reunification was already in the cards, but not yet there. And also, how could and did Southern European countries agree to such a regime? I think I don't have time. Maybe we can go back to these, if you're interested, to these questions, which regard 25 years ago, but are still very much inscribed in the inner balance of power of Europe today. It's a relatively unexplored historiographic question. Germany was, in a word, seeking redistribution of costs associated with asylum seekers' reception, which were already borne disproportionately by Germany at the time. So Europeanization was a way of redistributing. Whether it worked or not, it's another issue. And Southern Europeans had a strong urge to belong to the club in some way, and they felt they had become immigration countries like the others, of this idea that we all had to share the task of controlling borders was taken rather aproblematically. So what happens in this more recent period, 2008, 2011, and beyond? The whole basis, structural foundations of these regimes are endangered, are weakened by a couple of macro developments. One is, of course, the economic crisis, which has a very asymmetrical impact on Europe, hitting Southern Europe much more strongly than continental and Northern Europe, and therefore reducing the capacity of Southern European states, Mediterranean states, to attract and retain migration. Because you mustn't forget that in the 5 years before the outburst of a crisis, early 2000s, Spain and Italy were the two largest receiving countries, and I'm talking of not transit migration, of settlement migration for economic purposes of Europe. And Spain was the largest immigration country in the world after the US in sheer absolute numbers. I'm not talking of relative numbers. Something which sounds, incredible today. And this changes with the crisis. The other thing which changes, of course, is the capacity and willingness of southern Mediterranean states, North African states primarily, to perform a role of, delegated control, externalized control on behalf of Europe. Because one other thing that we tend to forget now, it seems ages ago, but it is true, I mean, Europe has relied for many years on the paid cooperation by people like Mubarak, Ben Ali, Gaddafi, to make its own migration and asylum regime sustainable. Of course, this was based on a number of contradictions if you look at it from a normative point of view. Arab uprisings and the wave of instability which ensues makes a difference in reducing the effectiveness of externalization, but also in triggering conflicts and in producing, of course, this is waves of forced migration, not talking only about Syria, but also about a number of other countries with a prominent role taken by the collapse of state in Libya, which becomes a major corridor from both Middle East, Eastern Africa, and Western Africa. So crisis and instability there. This generates a growth in mixed flows across the Mediterranean. Mixed flows means there is a debate on what it can and should mean, but basically different types of migrants bundled into irregular channels. And growth in transit flows of people who land in Greece and Italy, plus and now also a number of other countries of first entry, and want to continue the way to Northern Europe and Germany. The impact of this transition is highly differentiated. Europe is affected in a very asymmetrical way. This is the detective border crossings between crossing points, and you see over the last few years, and I'm saying a few words on 2015 now, you see that it's reaching an unprecedented peak with a major role until very recently and still now for sea crossings, even though in the last year land crossings have grown in importance. In 2015, of course, these figures can be updated, unfortunately, daily. This is, July, but it is now over 350,000 arrivals, with more or less stable numbers for Italy, but we have still, Italy received 100 and something. Last year, we are already at 115 maybe, we'll get higher, but the major explosion, in numbers has taken place in Greece, from Turkey to Greece. The asymmetrical impact on Europe is evident also if you look at the other fundamental indicator, which is numbers of asylum applications, and here it is not anymore the southern peripheral countries, but Germany, which represents the epicenter, the core of the impact, and followed by Hungary in the last year, and the impact is heavy, and the European response is unbalanced, not only in terms of arrivals, but also in terms of human toll. Deaths have been growing, from 2,081 last year to, this is already overtaken, of course. One child found dead on a Turkish beach is having a political impact, but there were hundreds of children dead in previous shipwrecks, of course, just they were not on the beach. Something has been done, or there have been attempts at doing something. I'm trying to list the main attempts. Mare Nostrum operation, it was launched in October 2013 after what was then, not anymore, the largest maritime tragedy since World War II in the Mediterranean. It's basically a unilateral assumption of responsibility by Italy, a major upgrade of previously existing search and rescue operations. It was discontinued. Well, it was very promising for us, for people in the field. It was totally unprecedented. This kind of unilateral, if you want, ethically based assumption of responsibility hadn't taken place anywhere before. You may make parallels with the boat peoples from Vietnam and the operation there, but this is different. I mean, it was not, first of all, it was not a war we had started. And then it's long ago, a totally changed geopolitical context. The US, just to make a transatlantic comparison, is not making anything like that in the Gulf of Mexico. It's never taken seriously, search and rescue. The policy is wet feet, dry feet. If you arrive on the land, you are a refugee. If you are in the sea, you are a migrant. This is changed, and it's a huge change of perspective. It failed. It failed because Italy was basically forced by internal opposition and international, including European opposition, to abandon that approach. Of course, the political goal by Italy was to try and bring in Europeans. It didn't work. I'm not going into details. It was replaced by an originally much smaller and disappointing and unfit operation led by Frontex called Triton. Since then, Triton has been slowly and silently boosted. It has evolved into a sort of, somebody was saying yesterday, Mare Nostrum Light. It is performing search and rescue at a larger scale, with a longer distance of operation, closer to the Libyan territorial waters, but still it's not yet comparable to what it was. Also because it's undeclared. I mean, it's undercover in a sense. I mean, nobody will say in Warsaw at Frontex headquarters that they are performing a large-scale search and rescue operation. It's not conceptualized, framed like that. Second thing, mandatory relocation scheme. This time it was another tragedy which triggered an acceleration in the policy process, 19th of April 2015, the so far largest maritime disaster in the Mediterranean, off the waters of Misrata in Libya. The EU Commission, Juncker, after perhaps the most disappointing European Council ever in terms of deliverables, Juncker takes a strong stance and decides to accelerate. He proposes this mandatory relocation scheme. So redistributing the arrivals across the member states, basically discontinuing Dublin, making an exception to Dublin, because Dublin wouldn't allow this, if taken literally. The Commission has to take a step back quickly. I mean, the June European Council, this is recent history, basically rejects the idea of a mandatory scheme, even though temporary. Things are changing day by day. Yesterday, I was telling before, France and Germany joined Italy, it seems, in claiming for good such a scheme. I will say a few words on the outlook of this policy proposal before concluding. Another attempt has been this naval CSDP operation, Common Security and Defense Policy. Maybe Pernille will say something about this. Decided by the Council, aimed at, first it was framed in terms of destroying the boats. Then it turned out that it was very clumsy, complicated, complete lack of reflection on the strategic implications of this. Then it was reformulated as an operation meant to disrupt the business model of smugglers. Not clear what it means. It's in a first phase now, which is basically exchange of the hardly existing intelligence on the model, on the operational model of smugglers among main member states. There is a phase 2, which is scheduled, consisting in destroying vessels, boats at sea, of course, after rescuing the people. I mean, it's not about bombing migrants. And a phase 3, which is about entering Libya and trying to destroy boats or to hamper the operation of smuggling rings in the country. But this is, of course, first of all, blocked by a number of legal problems in the UN Security Council and by the internal situation in Libya, and by a number of also tactical considerations, military tactical considerations. Then there are more wider international attempts. A forum, a talk shop called Khartoum Process was established last year in Khartoum under the pressure of Italy and a number of other countries, and under the supervision and official framing by the European Commission to try and bring transit countries, origin countries, mainly in Eastern Africa, and receiving countries in Europe together in discussing how to address cooperatively the issue of forced migration, protection, and smuggling. But the process is, to my knowledge, still at a very, very early and still phase with little tangible results. In November, there is a large Euro-African, Asian, Middle Eastern meeting scheduled, organized by the European Commission, which should probably assess, amongst other things, also the Khartoum process, and we will see what comes out of this external dimension of a European strategy. There is also something which has been happening on the financial side, because physical burden sharing, physical redistribution of refugees is obviously extremely difficult. It's easier to swap money, as always. Not easy, but slightly easier. So to compensate member states who are more invested, more burdened by money transfers. And these are the first beneficiaries of the new Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund and of the Internal Security Fund, the new funds which were created with the new financial perspectives launched by the European Union in 2014 until 2020. So you see that Italy, still Spain, because they have an established record of attracting many funds for this, for many reasons, and Greece are the first recipients, just not going into details. Which are the consequences of this that I think can be safely assessed as a strategic impasse. Now things are moving. Yesterday there were developments, but so far the strategy is not operational yet. The consequences are, of course, more deaths. We saw the numbers. Massive scale human rights violations. Almost every migrant transiting in Libya is abused in one way or another. We can talk about it. There is a strengthening and a structuring of smuggling networks, which become actors, also political actors, with a risk of becoming destabilizing actors, perpetuating the situations that allowed them to prosper, to accumulate wealth, and to professionalize. There is a loss of legitimacy of EU institutions. At least it's a risk. I mean, the step taken by Juncker, which I was talking about, and the quick retreat that the Commission was forced to do, was certainly a blow to the credibility of this Commission. Hopefully this wound will be healed quickly, but it's a wound. And deepening geopolitical rifts between border member states and their external neighbors, but also among member states. Following a domino effect. I'm saying a couple of words now on this. And then, of course, on the backdrop, expanding political room for xenophobic populist movements throughout Europe. What about the domino effect? Do I have 5 more minutes? Yeah. What happens for a state, particularly, a state which has, fed its political debate with a negative framing of migration, like almost all European states for decades? It's imperative to avoid becoming a dead end for flows, a dumping site for, refugees who cannot get to the final destination, because this turns into a political bomb. How can you do this if you are a government? Of course, first option is trying to let them through, to let them continue the trip, to let them follow their project, basically. Of course, this is not particularly fair in political terms, but there are a number of dirty games at play. But if the northern neighbor or the western neighbor builds a wall or puts the army, blocks the transit, what to do then? Then you have to make a wall yourself, to the south or to the east, because otherwise you're transformed into a dead end. So this is, in a nutshell, the dynamic at play that we already see at play. So we have Turkey, Greece. This happened already in the past years. With Greece was, I'm not saying forced, but decided to build a fence, near the Evros route, on the Evros route. It happened the same between Turkey and Bulgaria, another European wall. It happened the same, well, different ways, but between Italy and France. You have seen the pictures of, those transit migrants on a Schengen border who were, blocked by the gendarmerie on the shore, on the rocks in Ventimille. Much smaller scale, but it's the same kind of political dynamic. Calais, of course. Every bilateral situation would need a specific discussion, but there are similarities in the kind of dynamics, psychological and political and operational dynamics which happen. And then Serbian Republic, Hungary. Macedonian Serbian Republic, because the domino effect it can go forward or backward, it depends. And so on. It can happen at the border between Norway and Sweden. I'm not a warmongering, and I know it's a very special and lucky situation, but every border potentially becomes a line of tension, depending on how sensitive the issue is from a political point of view. Because for every state, survival is the first imperative. Survival as a ruling bloc, as a state, as not necessarily, as a democratic and liberal society. So what to do? This is a recipe. A joint European asylum policy will be the next major European project. These issues will preoccupy us much more in the future than the issue of Greece and the stability of Europe. Is this a migration scholar? Is this a radical analyst? Is this a prophetic Christian thinker? It's Angela Merkel in her ZDF interview, an important milestone in the change, in the revirement of change of attitude of Germany throughout the summer, basically. Germany turned from a position of defending the status quo. There is Dublin, there are rules, everybody has to comply, not so differently from what has happened on the Euro crisis, to an innovative position. The previous regime is unsustainable for us and therefore for Europe. So we have to change. But how? This is not yet evident. And it is by absolutely not evident that Germany and the core of states, including France and Italy, the large founding states of a European community, which is starting to consolidate around Germany. It's not in any way to be taken for granted that this core will have a political credibility, force, and strategic clarity of vision to turn this into a policy, a long-term policy. A few final personal hints. I am still, in spite of the developments yesterday, very cautious, if not skeptical, on the top-down enforcement of solidarity, on this idea of mandatory redistribution, mandatory relocation of refugees, of asylum seekers. I think that the idea that the European Union becomes an agency which brings you foreigners, different foreigners, Muslim foreigners, is a potentially, whether we like it or not, a potentially disrupting dynamic. So I think it's important that this principle is established, that the European Union, contrary to the flawed Dublin regime, has some sovereignty to redistribute people in need, in harsh need, but in my view, this cannot be the backbone of a response, because it's whether we like it or not, and I don't like it, but it's too risky for the fundamental stability of a European integration project. Nevertheless, I think we should keep trying, because it's symbolically important, politically important to have something in that direction. But maybe we have to experiment both subtler and bolder ways to enforce the principle of solidarity, which is solemnly inscribed in the treaties. So maybe joining forces for good in search and rescue, creating a European Coast Guard or a European search and rescue and control. I mean, it doesn't have, the two are inseparable, which is not, I mean, the progress in Triton is important, and also the role of countries like yours. I mean, this ship, CM, I think, which operates in the Mediterranean and is a very important message. It's a symbol, but it's also a very important practical thing, because it teaches countries which had not the opportunity to touch, with their hands and see with their eyes what is happening, to realize that, to appreciate what is being done, to learn or to transfer knowledge about how to perform very, very complex and delicate and important operations such as these. Another avenue which has partly started to be explored and should, I think, be explored more, in more depth, is enhancing the mobility for labor purposes of accepted, recognized refugees. Because, of course, transferring asylum seekers who have just landed is a very dramatic operation. Shocking for the asylum seekers themselves, primarily. They are forced to migration a second time, because you mustn't forget that asylum seekers didn't want, thinking of a scenario in which we have a relocation, they don't want to go where we are sent. They wanted to go elsewhere in the largest number of cases. But if you think of a relocation based on spontaneous choices, based on job offers, based on forecasts of job dynamics, after a while, today an asylum seeker, a refugee can move around in Europe only after 5 years, when he or she has gained a stable status, permanent residency status under EU law. Then they are entitled, like other migrants, to move for short periods, and if they find jobs under certain conditions, to take the job. Maybe we could shorten this, therefore thus making the relocation less visible and not forcible, not enforced on asylum seekers and on states, but of course, at the roots of all this, there is a perception that receiving such people is a minus, it's not a plus. Because if we were all convinced that an asylum seeker is not only a person, deserving something, having a legitimate expectation and a claim from us, but also an asset, the whole thing would be different. I mean, we would scramble for them. This is not the case. This is not the case because, we come from decades of negative framing of migration without careful distinctions between, forced migrants, asylum seekers, economic migrants, and the distinction is very blurred, increasingly so. So one other thing that it needs to be done, although it's hugely difficult, it's on a cultural level, continuing to try and change this negative framing, because Europe will need migrants. I mean, this is out of discussion. And finally, radically shifting the core, the center of gravity of European integration from the inner building to the external projection. Europe has been developing for half a century, more than half a century, in an introverted way, taking advantage of the protected international environment, first the bipolar environment, and then the belt of dictatorships on the southern shore, which allowed us to continue doing our little Schengens. This is not there anymore, so we have to change the approach, to shift the barycenter, to shift the weight to the outside. But this is, of course, extremely difficult. First, because there is not one geopolitical Europe. There are at least, I would say, three. There is a geopolitical Europe which gives priority to the south, to the southeast, to the Mediterranean, to the Middle East, because it is touched in its interests, in its sensitivities. There is a geopolitical Europe which gives priority to the east, to Russia, to the perceived or real, how real threat of Russian neighbors. And there is an insular Europe, which is not only UK. I mean, there are islands which have land borders. So all this is a major obstacle. And the other major obstacle is, of course, that in order to operate this shift of gravity, you have to operate a major shift of money, to rethink the EU's budget and perhaps the sources and the mechanisms of funding radically. From the inside, from inner consolidation, from the market development from the protectionist policies to outside. And this, for instance, is very difficult when you see thousands of agricultural tractors, how do you call them, in the Paris streets yesterday. They are protesting against the low prices of agricultural goods, and they ask for protection from the French state. But they are already receiving huge protection from the EU. This is the main item of expenditure at EU level. We know it fairly well. I mean, common agricultural policy. Of course, you cannot have both. You cannot have protecting EU inside and civil power. It has we have liked to to define it like this, without any real challenge for long, a civil power capable to project itself outside. Is this possible? I think this will be the driving question for some decades for Europe, and there is very much at stake, I mean, throughout Europe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ferruccio, for a very interesting presentation. I also very much agree with your conclusion that there is a need for a better balance between the different member states, and especially between the southern and the eastern member states' priorities. It is quite clear to all of us now that this crisis cannot be reduced to a sub-regional crisis, as it affects the Union as such, and also including Norway. It is, of course, urgent to find a way to handle the current crisis, but also how to handle the root causes. So in my very short comment, I will say a few words about both, but concentrating on the implications for EU's foreign policy in general and the neighborhood policy in particular. I have noticed that this crisis is often referred to as being a migration crisis, and you said also initially that you didn't like that term. And in my view, the current crisis is really a humanitarian crisis and a refugee crisis that may very well lead to a migration crisis. Because if you look at the numbers, as much as 60 to 70% of the migrants have refugee status and who will get their asylum application approved if they get a chance to apply. So while it's still crucial to find a way to return those who do not have this status and thereby preventing more from taking these dangerous journeys, the EU also needs to find a way to take care of those who really need protection. And this is, as you also mentioned, is what the European Commission is now working on. And the EU member states will most likely make decision based on this proposal in a 10 days' time. And this decision will probably concern, as you mentioned, new quotas, maybe also common registration facility, list of safe countries, and concrete plan for repatriations, etc. But until then, the member states have to tackle this as best they can. And this is, as we are witnessing right now, challenging enough and requires a lot of ad hoc solutions and goodwill of the European populations. But in the case that the interior ministers, justice minister, do not manage to make the necessary decisions when they meet the 14th of September, this crisis may very well risk destabilizing the Union as such, as it may threaten core pillars as you mentioned, the Schengen, the principle of free movement of persons, and it may turn into a very chaotic situation with a lot of tensions. And in addition, to find a way to handle the current refugee crisis, the member states also have to find a way to address the challenge of migration as such, and which is very likely to increase as a consequence of this current refugee crisis. And this might also prove very challenging. A likely implication of this crisis is that the EU will have to strike a balance between providing support for democratization and development in third countries on the one hand, and promoting stability and security in these countries on the other. And the EU has often been criticized for giving priority to the latter. The current crisis shows that both are necessary, and the EU cannot be reduced simply to being a normative actor in its foreign policy. It has shown that this is simply not sustainable. So even though the migration crisis is not a direct result of a failed neighborhood policy, it is clear that this policy, which was established in 2004 and initially aimed at creating a ring of friends and stability around the EU, has not reached its objective. Most refugees are now coming from Syria via Turkey, and a combination of migrants and refugees are coming from different African countries via Libya. And interestingly, these two main transit countries are both partner or candidate countries, at least on paper. In spite of this, it is also important to look at where the EU's policy towards the neighborhood countries in the south seem to work. In fact, fewer non-migrants are now coming via Morocco or Tunisia. And this was the most common route some years back. And these are also partner countries with the EU, but partner countries with which the EU has established a priority relationship. This means that the EU has signed association agreements, deep free trade agreement, as well as mobility partnerships, and quite substantial financial support is coming from the EU to these countries. Thus, these countries are considered as southern partner countries who are the closest associated with the EU. So we may also argue that in the cases where the EU has been able to develop a closer partnership with the southern neighbors, this policy actually works. So to conclude, I think it is important to distinguish between the current refugee crisis and the migration crisis that will probably come, because very different measures are needed. The refugee crisis has shown that the EU crisis response mechanism does not work. But there is a chance now that this will push the EU to take decisions in 10 days' time that will improve this capacity. But whether or not the EU manage to make decisions that also will improve its more long-term policy to assist the countries in the region where the migrants are coming from is more uncertain. But it has to build on the current policy that actually work, and I think that the cooperation with Morocco, for instance, is interesting in that regard. And in addition, it is clear that some sort of a Marshall Plan is needed for the whole region where the migrants are coming from, and this is becoming increasingly urgent. In Norway, this is often referred to as an EU problem, but it concerns Norway as well. The so-called Arctic route via Turkey to Russia is a reminder of that, via Turkey to Russia and to Norway. Thus, it is important that Norway take its share of responsibility and support the EU in its effort to handle these challenges, I think, both in the short term and also in the long term. Thank you.
Let me just start, Ferruccio, by thanking you for a great presentation. I'm very happy to be here, and I think these are immensely important issues that we are discussing today. I will, as I am not an expert at all on the European Union and European Union policies towards neither this issue nor almost any other issue, I will try to sort of take off where Pernille ended and sort of start by asking this question to myself and to you. I mean, why are we seeing this thing that is now referred to as a refugee crisis? Why are we seeing this at this particular moment in time? Why didn't this come 2-3 years ago? I mean, the Syrian civil war has been going on for quite some time now. Why do we see this at this particular moment? And much as Ferruccio, I think that this is, I believe that this is the story of a crisis foretold, and really something that we should have anticipated. Because in my point of view, what we see today is a consequence of an established order of handling refugees that has reached its breaking point. And there are several reasons why it had reached its breaking point. One is, as you alluded to, that the loss of the controlling agents in the south. I mean, basically regimes that helped Europe control this, from Mubarak in Egypt to Gaddafi in Libya and Ben Ali in Tunisia and so on and so forth. But I think we also need to look deeper into the causes and the consequences of this. Because if we look at how the post-Second World War regime for refugee management was built up, and I'm not here talking about the formalized treaties, but more about the informal practices of how this has been handled, basically since the end of the Second World War. It has been built on two particular pillars. One of the protection of refugees within refugee-producing regions, and then a tiny minority of those were lifted out to other regions as Europe and so on and so forth. This has been the practice all along, that the majority of refugees were supposed to receive protection within the refugee-producing regions. And then we were supposed to sort of take our symbolic part of our burden sharing through UN quotas of refugees and so on and so forth. What this probably led to is that we have taken the integrative capacity of local host communities and countries almost for granted. And it's very clear to me that we cannot take that integrative capacity for granted anymore. That part of this system has reached its overload. And so you have an overload of the integrative capacity in refugee-producing regions, be that the Middle East, countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, be it in the Sahel, or be it even further south in Africa. It has reached its overload. Why has it reached this? Well, one reason is because that these conflicts are seemingly, if not permanent, at least immensely long-lasting. They simply don't end. And neither the refugees that comes out of Syria nor the host communities in neighboring countries see any end to the Syrian crisis. And this is probably creating a sort of double momentum of movement. And you see the same thing in the Sahel, in Afghanistan, and so on. I mean, conflicts that just continues and produce ever more people which feel that they are in the danger of becoming permanent refugees. And when enough people probably think that they are in the process of becoming permanent refugees, that the conflict that I run away from, it will never end. I'm ending up here in some sort of refugee situation, some sort of a limbo where I will never become a civilian citizen again. I am lost as a refugee. It also leads people to think about what are the alternatives. And when some people are starting to jump on possible alternatives, more will continue. So it's a self-sustaining movement, but it's sort of created by an overload locally. And unfortunately, since we were totally unprepared for this, and I think we were totally unprepared, at least for the sheer numbers, even if the numbers that is coming into Europe is a small fraction of the millions of people that are either internally displaced or are refugees around the world. It's a small fraction. We need to remember that. I mean, the major crises of displacement are not happening on the shores of Europe. They are happening elsewhere. It's a tiny fraction of the numbers. But still, I mean, it's something that we were completely unprepared for. And of course, and unfortunately, as people are desperate to try to improve their situation in one way or another, this also gives rise, as was also alluded to alternative regimes of movement, if you like, and flows. Routes for escape that are dangerous, but also creates and therefore creates and sustains different illicit economies, which are again self-sustaining. But all of these are demand-driven, and as more and more people are on the move, more will follow, at least in the short to medium-term horizon. And we need to face up to the fact that this is not just the summer of 2015 phenomenon. This is something that is going to last for quite a long time. And therefore we need better both short-term but also long-term policies. And I'm a little afraid that right now, as Europe also and the political elite in Europe also goes into crisis mode over this, that one loses sight of that the only sort of real solution to this will be found in trying to find more long-term solutions to this. There is really no sustainable answer to the refugee crisis that Europe feels it is facing now on the shores of Europe. The sustainable answer to this is elsewhere in the world. So, I mean, there is no immediate end to this, which means that we need to think about both short-term and long-term solutions. The short-term solutions are mostly in Europe and in Europe's borders, and how to handle this as humanely, but also as effectively as possibly in Europe and on Europe's borders. But what could then be the long-term solutions? And here different issues has been discussed. taking out the boats, going after these so-called illicit networks. Yes and no. I mean, clearly there are illicit networks and illicit flows and people who are making money on this. There is no doubt about that. But at least we need to keep in mind, I think, that when one, and there is talk about this business model of this, but what kind of business model is actually this? When I discuss this with people from various security establishments, I get the feeling that they're talking about some sort of a cartel-like mafia model of business, which I think is very far from what is actually going on. This is much more ad hoc, organized with fluid and floating networks involved, meaning that this idea that there are some hidden sort of bosses behind there, and if we only can take out those, then this will sort of end. I think that's a relatively naive thought. One will just be, take out one, and it will be just be sort of replaced by another one. I mean, so what are we then left with? I think we are left with a couple of options. All of them are costly, and none of them are, will sort of work immediately. But we need to have a long-term approach to this. First, we need to protect the global framework for handling refugees, because there is no alternative to it. There is no alternative to the established practice of simply that the majority of refugees get protection within refugee-producing regions. There is no alternative to it, as I see it, because the other alternative is much worse, and that is that you get huge, massive amounts of refugees that are pushed from one country to another because nobody really wants to have them. So there is no alternative to that established order. But we need to find a new way of designing burden sharing within this. The number of people that can be taken out from refugee-producing regions will always be relatively tiny. But there are other ways that we can take part in an ethical and effective burden sharing on this. And particularly, I think that in order to protect this global framework, we need to invest heavily both in hosting countries and in host communities. That is the only way we can protect this part of how the refugee crises are handled. Secondly, we need to also invest much more heavily in building resilience in fragile countries and regions. Much more emphasis needs to be put on this, at least avoiding that further states collide into the kind of collapse that we see, for instance, in Syria and parts of the Sahel. And we need a much more proactive approach to this. Right now, I mean, the international community has a tendency of neglect until something really goes bad. It is cheaper and much more effective to start investing heavily before things go bad. Which means that we need both a new European and a new global policy towards fragile and conflict-prone regions. And in order, the only way we can do that is to try to work much more effectively with local partners in both building resilience, but also in rebuilding things that has fallen apart, like Libya. And it is sort of, to me, it's always been amazing how quickly certain European countries rushed in on the military intervention in Libya, and how quickly they vanished from the scene after the Gaddafi state fell. And of course, I'm not saying that the West is to be blamed in general for all of these crises that is producing refugees around the world, but clearly, I mean, our footprint is visible in Iraq, it's visible in Libya, it's visible in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So it's not only, we have an ethical obligation to deal much better with this, as well as it is in our own interest. Because we have to remember that at least parts of these Syrian refugees that are produced is a direct result of the Islamic State, and the Islamic State would never have been what it is today if it hadn't been for extremely silly politics by the West and the US in Iraq. That's obvious. That's totally obvious. And the same with regard to the trafficking across the sea from Libya to Italy. Basically, I mean, this became a growth industry in a country without a state. And I'm not saying that I'm not saying this in any way to sort of rebrand the image of Gaddafi. I mean, I'm in full support of a population right to rebel against life under a dictatorship. I'm just saying that the way we handled both the intervention and particularly its aftermath, when we were apart from a few countries, Italy is one exception, the rest of the Western alliance, very quickly sort of ran away from Libya and saying that Libya is so rich, so they can fix this themselves. It doesn't really help to have a lot of money if there has never been a nation state there, and that was the fact that the Libyan nation didn't exist beyond the Gaddafi state. And now we are left to pay the price of this. But unfortunately, I mean, we may feel that we are paying a price for this now with the refugee crisis, but the real price for this refugee crisis, that is paid elsewhere in the world by vulnerable people in vulnerable situations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a big topic. We heard excellent presentation by Ferruccio, and now good comments from the audience, and we have lots of interesting people in the audience as well. So now I suggest that maybe Ferruccio, you get a minute or two to respond to some of the remarks that Pernille and Morten gave, and then we open the floor, and we will continue. We have still quite some time, so we can continue for another 30 or 40 minutes.
Yeah. Well, I think we are all very much on the same line. Before gathering questions, I respond to a couple of points. Of specific points, I would say, because on the generalities, I think we are very much on the same lines. A couple of practical points, I think, which are worth picking up. One of the suggestions made by Morten is investing in host communities. I think that this is a very, maybe a very obvious thing, but also a crucially important and a difficult thing to be done. When Germany performed this U-turn, at least in programmatic policy, over the last few weeks, they also, the German government announced a major boost in transfers from the federal state to the lender, over €1 billion, basically to buy the consensus to a redistributive regime which puts the burden, the everyday burden in social terms and economic terms on the lender, not on Berlin. And this explains why also the most conservative states didn't oppose the move. I mean, Bavaria so far, at least. And this happens at all levels, I think. Solidarity should be commended, but should also be in some way rewarded. This applies from the neighborhood. If a neighborhood makes itself actively available to reconceive its internal organization for reception, it has to be rewarded in some way. This has to be recognized. It doesn't work the other way around, that we expect solidarity by default, and then if it doesn't come, we blame. Yeah, maybe in an ideal moral world, it could work like this. It doesn't in this world. So one thing about the smugglers, the facilitating networks, as scholars call them. There is on this, like in many other areas of this complicated and highly sensitive debate where words count a lot, there is a lexical controversy. I think I agree with what Morten was saying, that there is often a sort of uncontrolled, criminalization based on unchecked premises. So we know that internationally the bad guys are mafia-like organizations. There is somebody who is developing a new market, so we apply the mafia categories, the approaches. This doesn't necessarily work because mafia, as it was unfortunately invented in my country and in a major receiving state of Italian migration, the US, under a regime of prohibition in the 30s, well before, but it bloomed in that period, is a hierarchical organization with powerful control over a territory. Mafia developed in, Cosa Nostra is a specific Sicilian mafia developed in Sicily to exploit a sedentary community, to exploit a territory. Therefore, it needed roots in the territory, control of a territory. Smuggling rings exploit a mobile community, exploit mobility. So they don't necessarily need control of a territory. They need temporary control of a territory, of a landing and embarkation points, for instance. They need control of a territory in order to secure so-called safe houses for the migrants, which are not at all safe for the migrants, but for the organization, before embarking. But this is carried out through agreements with local corrupt officials and maybe criminal organization. Corruption is a huge, untold dimension of the whole problem, which is, of course, very, very hard to tackle in Euro-African whatever dialogue. And I mean, it's without corruption, in most places, nothing would happen, of course. So it's not pyramid-like mafias, but it's structured organizations. I'm also, very critical against some of my colleagues who tend to reduce all this to, facilitating organizations who meet the request, the demand from migrants for profit, but it's a legitimate fee because they respond to a vital need, to a demand. I mean, this may apply to some cases. I mean, but we are not anymore in the romantic season of Pasteur helping European Jews to cross from France to Spain or across the Ventimille passes during the Second World War. I mean, those two were asking for a fee. You may wonder whether they were smugglers or not, but today this is... of course, there are organizations which are made of fellow nationals. There are very interesting judiciary files by Italian judiciary authorities, prosecutors, on the structure well, very little serious investigative work has been done for good reasons. I mean, but there are some interesting inquiries made by national anti-mafia authority in Italy, showing that there are interconnections. So the Eritrean networks are now able to ensure the whole package from Eritrea to Sweden by connecting locally with local counterparts. And they are doing it for their fellow nationals. And at least at departure, these are keen to buy the services. They are grateful to the smugglers. But this doesn't hold necessarily for the whole trip. But it's a long, complex.
Okay, thank you so much. If you want to join in, could you please just raise your hand and maybe, is there anybody who wants to jump in? Questions? Over here.
Yes, hello. My name is Kirsti Metti from the European Movement Norway. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I would like to address the kind of clash between values and politics. In Norway, we are extremely proud of having a boat, the CM Pilot, in the Mediterranean Sea that picks up and saves refugees. But once you put the refugees on a border or in a country, it becomes politics. So with the values that we like to think of, as in solidarity and so on and so forth, seems to get lost once it goes into the political field of things. And I was just wondering whether in Europe, I mean, the whole crisis has its international, European and national politics that comes into play. And it becomes very complex to handle because it's so many levels and conventions and rules and regulations. And it becomes such a patchwork that it seems that we get a little bit paralyzed politically in how to have a clear European response to this. And on the other hand, we see a popular uprising in people reacting to this by just, by impulse, organizing help schemes and welcoming schemes and so on and so forth. So there is such a huge gap between the politics of things and the response that maybe most people would like to give. And have we come in Europe to a kind of, or in the world, so to speak, that we have bureaucratized, having too many systems and too many technical and political barriers, so that we are not able to act and to operate in a manner that corresponds to the values that the European Union is based on in the first place, with human rights, solidarity, rule of law, and so on and so forth. It seems to be really under threat in the way that we have, that we are showing in Europe that we're not able to act properly to this challenge. Thank you.
Yes, maybe shall I
please
reply? I think you touch upon the fundamental contradiction which explains most of this. I mean, the contradiction between our European identity, which is, we sincerely, more or less sincerely, believe that we are liberal democracies, and we are, good citizens of a democracy based on individual freedom, on individual dignity. And our instincts, and our, basically the instinct to protect our well-being, but more fundamentally, our order, the order around us. I think one very interesting paradox is that much poorer and less structured societies like for instance, the Jordanian society, the Lebanese society, are proving much more open to reception, de facto, much more capable to sustain very important contingents, numbers, to adapt to a major transformation in their social landscape than our much richer and more structured society. Because there is, it's not just about the welfare. There is a stake. But there is, I think, a more fundamental stake, which is social order. We are treated with social order. We are, and you probably more than us in Italy. I mean, we have different perceptions and feelings about what is the acceptable level of disorder around us. And this is something which creates panic. So this contradiction is there. And the margins for ethical action from above are limited because of this. Because we are not, strictly speaking, majoritarian democracies. We are liberal democracies, but the majority principle is still extremely powerful because it decides who wins the elections, basically. And so ethical initiatives from above by the leadership, if they are not well prepared with cultural action to make it acceptable, palatable for electorates, they backfire. This is very bitter to say, but it's the lesson of Mare Nostrum, and it could be, I hope not, but the lesson of the decision by Germany to suspend unilaterally Dublin. Basically, Germany, a couple of weeks ago, decided we will take Syrians wherever they come from, wherever they got here through. So we do not enforce Dublin asking for readmission. Okay, somebody says that the marginal practical cost of this is limited because Dublin readmissions to Greece were already suspended because courts had established that the conditions of reception in Greece were not acceptable, therefore you could not deport them back to Greece. And transits of Syrians through Italy had plummeted in the last year because Syrians and the rings exploiting Syrian migration realized that the transit through Libya was too dangerous, therefore the Libyans, who can generally afford it, took another route. It's only the poorest of the poorer now, so West Africans mainly, which are still forced into the Libyan funnel. So Germany took this initiative, which is an ethically based, of course not only, but also ethically justified policy. We take Syrians, whatever their route. But instead of getting, praise, the immediate reaction from some member state was to, warn about the magnet effect. You are creating a legal mess. And indeed, it's not false. I mean, how can you discontinue a regulation for just some nationalities? Yeah, it's not evident from a legal point of view. But the important thing from what you were saying is that a number of leaders in Europe said, but by doing this, you will generate a pull factor. So yes, the contradiction between principles, ideals, values, and political instincts and fundamental psychological instinct is there.
Morten, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, just very briefly. Just to add to what Ferruccio was already saying, I think that we need to, as happy as I am to see these kind of spontaneous displays of welcoming, of support and solidarity, I would be careful to read too much into it. I'm uncertain whether they actually represent sort of the general sentiment in Europe, and we just have to acknowledge that large waves of migration have always created this kind of almost an existentialistic uncertainty in populations. That has been the case. That's the case of Europe, but it's also the case of Africa and elsewhere. That is, it seems to be a relatively universal feature of mankind. Sometimes we are able to handle it better than other times, but it always comes with these kind of challenges. And I think we should be careful to read too much into it, and we'll see how this will actually play out on the political landscape in Europe in forthcoming elections, I believe. If I may just say one more thing, Ulf, going back to the exchange we had on smuggling network, trafficking network, facilitators of mobility, if you like. I mean, I just want to sort of underscore that my remark about that this did not sort of fit into this kind of more Hollywood version of the Sopranos mafia-like business model does not sort of mean that I in any way romanticize this. I mean, it is dangerous and dirty for everybody involved. It's just that since it's lack this hierarchical structure, it's immensely difficult to target it through some sort of limited, for instance, military or police operations. So one need to come up with much better policies against this, and the first step is basically to get better analytical clarity about how this actually works. And we don't have that knowledge today. That was my simple point.
Okay, now we have some people. Yeah, order first.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk. My name is Kari. I work in an NGO called Norwegian People's Aid. And my question is more practical. We heard during the discussions on the agenda on migration before summer that they were talking about these hotspots that they were to establish in Italy, and it might have been Greece. And I was wondering if you could elaborate, or if you know anything more about where that is now and how the discussions are. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Could we just collect one more question?
Course. Yeah.
My name is Bøås. Thanks to NUPI for organizing this very timely and interesting seminar, and thanks to the presenter. One question about the interregional cooperation. You mentioned very briefly the Khartoum process. I don't know very much about it. You did not seem to put much hope within it. But there have been efforts ongoing for many years for a Euro-Arab dialogue cooperation. Of course, the Arab world is torn by a number of other disputes, so it's not in the best of shapes. But could you, are there any processes, initiative to strengthen contact dialogue with the Arab world? Because this is a crisis also for them. Because those leaving, for instance, Syria now are those who were supposed to be the future of Syria. So it is also a tremendous drain of resources from the Arab world to our part of the world. Could you tell us a little about if there are any contacts, dialogues with Europe, with the European Union and Arab countries, either individually or collectively? Thank you.
Okay, so hotspots and the dialogue.
Yeah, hotspots. It's a very important, dimension of the current short-term negotiations, because one of the stumbling blocks in the early phase of the debate was the mistrust from continental European partners, member states, towards Italy and Greece and a number of other, mainly Italy and Greece, in their capacity and willingness to perform systematically their duty to fingerprint and register asylum seekers upon disembarkation. Because as you know, in order to be operational, Dublin needs filing people So you have to be fingerprinted as a proof that you were, that you were officially registered by the country of first entry. In case of willingness to issue an asylum claim, you had the possibility to file an asylum claim. These fingerprints are stored in a European data set called Eurodac. This allows, if the person then moves across borderless, so-called borderless Schengen area to Germany, first thing German authorities do when they are presented with an asylum claim, they go and check in the Eurodac dataset. If your fingerprints are there, stored by Italy 2 weeks ago, you're going to the queue for Dublin deportation, basically. Yeah? It's not called deportation because it's inside Europe we don't deport. But it's basically this. It's a forcible relocation north-south rather than south-north as the ones we were discussing before. So this fundamental lack of trust had some grounds. I mean, I'm not obviously talking in any official capacity. For some time, there was a rather discontinuous, I would say, engagement by some member states, I think including my own, in applying Dublin rules with this regard. This can be explained politically. There is a fundamental principle of solidarity which is enshrined in the treaties, and it is not enforced. So why should all other principles be enforced so systematically? This is a political, sheer, raw politics. There are other more practical considerations. In order to take forcibly fingerprints from anybody, you have to apply, force, physical force. You have to, which is, you need, in our constitutional orders, you need to have the authorization from a judge normally, or reasons of extrema ratio, of force majeure. There is no provision in the Schengen and Dublin complex normative for regulating the use of force in these cases. And so taking forcibly fingerprints from, whatever, a woman, a child, a strong man is not an easy thing. I mean, if the guy or the lady is against. In any case, if you take fingerprints, then you cannot apply systematic detention on all those who have been fingerprinted. And in most cases, fingerprinting is, of course, something that asylum seekers aiming north are trying to avoid. But even if they are fingerprinted, they are not giving up to their project to moving north because they have survived everything. So they take the risk, they go north, and then if I am deported again to Italy, that's fine. I mean, it will happen, but meanwhile I go north. But this was the climate until a little ago. Then Italy made official steps to make, to take new practical approaches to systematic fingerprinting, trying to overcome this mistrust, this wall of mistrust. There was a progress in mutual understanding, but basically hotspots are devices, in my reading, but to make sure that this happens. So we, place some controllers there, a joint facilities where fingerprinting and identification operations are carried out under joint, responsibility with common control. in order to make sure that it happens. Of course, this is acceptable for members, for Greece and Italy, if there is a counterparty. Because otherwise, I mean, this kind of guardianship is something which is politically very hard to accept. And the counterparty is solidarity, is relocation. So this is my, maybe I mean, there are diplomats in the room, maybe they can bring their own feelings on this very sensitive knot, but this is my understanding. Khartoum and regional processes. I mean, there is a very important precedent. I told during my presentation that political action is often triggered by tragedies, by large-scale or larger-than-average tragedies which create a window of opportunity for policymakers. It sounds cynical, but it's like the previous window of opportunity was 2005, when some dozens of migrants, sub-Saharan migrants, were shot and died in the attempt to climb over Ceuta and Melilla fences. The trial never came to a final and convincing judiciary truth, but it seems that there were shots coming from the Moroccan gendarme. This created quite a shock, because it was and still is, well, there has been another episode, but the only episode in which people died because being shot, not by accident, by shipwreck, but because being shot at European borders since the World War. I mean, yeah, there were deaths when the Eastern Germans were shooting the people trying to exit, but this was entering. This triggered a phase of hectic political activism. UK at the time with Blair was in the driving seat. I mean, was, you know, political position changed quickly, relatively quickly. They were pushing for greater engagement. And this produced what was called then the Rabat process, a Euro-African forum for regional dialogue with sending and transit countries. A huge, you know, diplomatic effort, a venue. I don't know, I haven't followed so closely and from the inside, but from the outside, you hardly could detect any tangible outcome from this project. Khartoum, I mean, Khartoum's origin are just the same. It's just much more complicated, because in Rabat, the partners were Western African countries and Northern African countries at a time of relative stability. In this case, the partners are, you know, Sudan, Eritrea, an empty seat where Libya should sit, an empty seat where Syria should sit, and so on. So it's you know, and the interesting and innovative thing of Khartoum on paper is that it targets not only control, anti-smuggling, but also the externalization of protection. So the idea of, you know, safe avenues, what the Americans call offshore processing of asylum claims. Nominally, it is also there, but there hasn't been any, I would say, to my knowledge, step ahead. And I think that this regional approach, it's maybe needed for, you know, as a preparatory phase for foreign policy making, but foreign policy making needs to be targeted and tailored. So in this particular area, I mean, Eritreans are still the first group of forced migrants arriving in Sicily, I mean, being rescued in the Mediterranean. Eritrea is a priority in political terms. But this, you know, you don't talk Eritrea with, yeah, of course, Egypt, Sudan may have a voice in making a long-term policy to bring Eritrea back in a sphere of dialogue and productive negotiation, but it's primarily the EU and Eritrea. And by the way, we were talking about this yesterday evening with colleagues from NUPI and from the government, from the Norwegian government. Norway has a particular relationship with the Eritrean issue because of a tradition of engagement in the region, and this is a priority which could be concretely shared also with Norway, I think. Maybe it is already to some extent.
I'm so sorry, but I've been told that we have to end the seminar now. There's lots of people who wanted to say something. I'm sure they would have brought a lot of things, good things to the discussion as well. But I'm sorry, we have to end this session. Now, the purpose of this seminar for us was twofold somehow. First is, of course, to bring attention to the issue of migration, and also contribute to prepare, I think, a bit of the Norwegian public debate, because so much of the attention so far has been related to the humanitarian crisis. But I think all three of you, and in particular Ferruccio, have brought up the issue of what kind of political, long-term institutional solution are we looking at? What kind of problem is the kind of root cause? And also, I think, pointed to, you have said basically that there is no alternative apart from moving very radically towards changing the attitudes to migrants, changing the focus of the EU from internally driven to externally driven, radical reallocation of resources, etc. Now, all of these things that you said are imperative, we know as students of Europe and students of European societies have historically been very difficult. So this will be certainly testing times. It will be very difficult times. And I think it's also important that Norway joins in on these discussions. Also, the Norwegian society and Norwegian politics, etc., have to make important contributions to this debate. I'm not letting you comment anything on my remarks there, but just say that thank you so much for opening this debate. Certainly this will be a long-term theme, and we were happy to welcome all of you back at a later stage. Thank you so much.